The following broadcast was produced by the Lighthouse for the Blind in San Francisco as part of our Lighthouse Learning Library.
Has anybody driven in a car with a GPS that talks and you go off route and then all of a sudden it says recalculating? Well, it's an analogy to what happens in life. You take a career, do it for a while, and then all of a sudden, guess what? Something else has gone on. The industry has collapsed. You meet somebody, move to a different city, recalculating. The king of recalculating is about to speak, Mike Bullis. Mike Bullis has done more recalculating than any 14 other people I know. And he's going to tell you how he did it and what are the qualities that get you adaptable, nimble, and able to get where you want to go without hearing any of the other distractions. So, Mike, it's yours.
All right, thanks very much. I hope I can do the topic justice. It is a fascinating subject. It's one that has intrigued me ever since I accidentally started doing it, way back when. And that is, how do you move from one profession to another? How do you move from one job to another sort of smoothly and do it in a way that works for you and your family, and that doesn't lead to lengthy stints of unemployment and retooling and so forth. Again, like I began yesterday, I want to say it's not easy. I wish I could tell you that, life is just a barrel of fun and that I've had these incredible career switches that were just so exciting. My most recent one was I was working for the state of Maryland as an AT program director, and about a year ago there was an independent living, 3 years ago in Baltimore, there was an independent living center that went out of existence. It went out of existence because of some financial mismanagement and other things. And so we went for 2 years without an IL center in Maryland. And about a year ago, June, the feds put out an announcement that said there was going to be an independent living center application open in Baltimore. And I began calling people up and saying, organizations, nonprofits, people who were in the disability field, broad disability field, and saying, who's going to apply for this? And nobody was. And I thought, oh my God, that's not good. So fortunately, back in the 80s, and when I had an opportunity, I took some opportunities to go back and do federal grant reviews of independent living programs. And those are, anytime you can do that, by the way, just take the opportunity to go back and review federal grants. They're intimidating at first, but what you'll realize is that they're no smarter than you are, and that there really are some simple things to look for. So I knew how to write grants. I'd written a couple grants here and there. I knew how to write grants. And so I said to people, I'll write the grant, but let's pull together a group of 35 or 40, sort of players in the disability arena, and let's see what we want this center to look like. I had some of my own ideas and other people had theirs, so we pulled together a meeting, and then I wrote the IL grant, knowing, by the way, that nobody else was going to apply. So if I didn't really screw it up, we were going to get this grant. It was a $270,000 a year grant. Once you get it forever unless you really screw it up. Not bad, right? I had no intention of running the center, but people kept coming to me as time went by and saying, you know what, you really have the vision for this. You really know what this ought to look like. Why don't you do it? And I said, well, I really don't want to run an independent living center. What I want to do is an employment program for people with disabilities. And they said, well, that's great, because this is just sort of a seed money, and you can do that as well. And I thought, you're right. We can do that. So as time went along toward the end of the year, my boss actually called me up and said, Mike, we really need somebody like you to run that independent living center. And I said, are you trying to get rid of me? She said, no, I just think it's you. And I said, I've been thinking it is probably me as well. So beginning this January, I took the independent living center, but I want you to notice a few things. I took experience I'd already had. I had written some grants before. I know the federal RSA system because I've been around that a little bit. I pulled together 35 or 40 people I knew in the Baltimore area who were key players in the disability field. So all the things that I did were actually out of my current experience, weren't they? They weren't out of, I wasn't reaching way out over somewhere else. I was sort of reaching into the bag of tricks that I actually had. And I think that's really important. It's really important for you to, that's why a coach is so important. That's why Catherine and Julie are so important, is because they can help you figure out what you got. What is your bag of tricks or bag of skill sets? And then how can you weave them into that next step, whatever that next step may be for you? And so it is about thinking about what do I have and then what can I do next. We would like to do something very special about employment for people with disabilities, and so that's my vision for this new center, and it's very exciting. It first happened to me totally accidentally. I was Mike Bullis, the factory worker, when I got out of high school and college, because it's all I knew was working in factories doing assembly work. And I didn't know what else I could do. In fact, every time, my first factory assembly job was when I was in high school. Worked half-time at this factory making codophones at that time, which were fancy answering machines. And then that company had to lay me off because I had some slowdowns, and I was out of college temporarily because I needed money to live. So I started banging on factory doors, and nobody would hire me because you could tell it was, you're blind. What are you doing here at the factory? And finally, this guy that I had talked to 2 or 3 times one day called me up and said, "I'd like you to come in because we'd like to hire you." And I was like, "What?" So I asked him a few months later after he had hired me, and I said, "Why did you do that?" And he said, "I had no intention of hiring you. I thought you were probably helpless and that you'd be a danger to everybody on the factory floor. But," he said, "one day after you came in to see me, your resume was laying on my desk, and this guy came in and said, 'Oh my God, you know Mike Bullis?' And he goes, 'Well, he's applied for a job here once, but I don't know him.' And he said, 'He worked for us out at this Codaphone factory.' He said, 'He's a great employee. You ought to hire him.' So he said, 'That's why I called you.' And I thought, oh my gosh. So it really was about a reference that was totally accidental and serendipitous. And life is that way. The more, what was it, Benjamin Franklin said that he had found that the harder people worked, the more luck they had. I was out knocking on doors every morning, and eventually something good happened. Maybe it was partly fate, and who knows what your concept of God is or spirituality, but I have found that life leads you to things if you push, if you move, if you're always constantly creating energy, then good things happen to you eventually. And then the worst possible thing happened to me as I was working in this factory, and then I went back to college because I was kind of in between. I would go to college for a while, and then I would go out and work to make more money to go back to college. And one day I couldn't find a factory job, and I couldn't find anything. And this guy called me from the Commission for the Blind. He said, "I heard you were looking for work." And I was like, "Well, yeah, I am." And he said, "Well, we have a position out here in the shop." Everybody knows what the shop is. It was the workshop. And I was like, "Oh, dear God, help me, please. This will be the end of me." I was desperate. I said, well, what does it pay? Well, it pays piece rate. So I thought, legitimate piece rate or just piece rate? Anyway, I swallowed my pride, and I went down and I worked for these guys on a thing making something. I forget what it was. And the piece rate, hourly rate was, if you could do standard, was like $8 an hour, and I could do above standard. So I actually, or $7 an hour. So I actually ended up making $9, $10 an hour doing this, which in those days wasn't so bad of money, okay? And, but still, it was just total humiliation. I was like, oh my God, if this ever goes on my resume, I'm dead. Working in a sheltered shop is no good. So now I was Mike, the factory worker, sheltered shop guy, and that was bad. And so there were these annoying consumer groups that were complaining that the agency did a horrible job of placement, that they didn't help people get out of the shop, and that people in the shop were complaining to me, they never help us get out of here, et cetera. So I went to the guy who was the sort of employment director of the agency, and I said, I'd like to run an employment group. And he said, what, for those guys out in the shop? And he said, they're just complainers and whiners and blah, blah, blah. I said, whatever. I said, you know, I'd like to do it. I'll do it on my own time. I'll do it for free. And let's see if we can help some of these guys get jobs. Or let's just at least help them see where they can go. And he was like, well, it won't work. I said, well, okay, whatever. You know, I didn't tell him, you know, I'm desperate. I don't have a lot of options here. I said, tell you what, let's just try it. And he said, okay. Well, you know, I tried it. I discovered that I knew how to listen to these guys and help them take some action. And we got a few jobs out of the deal. The consumer groups quieted down because they were seeing some response. And the people out in the shop quieted down because they could see some options. And then, so that went on for a few months. And then finally I said to the agency one day, I said, you know, I think this is working pretty good. They said, yeah, we think it is too. I said, so now you need to pay me. And they were like, well, yeah, I guess you're right. And so they did. And then they needed an agency newsletter, but they'd never written one before. And I said, tell you what, I'll write an agency newsletter for you. And they said, well, okay, we'll give you that job, and so on. I started them out for free, by the way. If you want to know what my favorite free jobs are, you guys can all have a job within a month. Are you ready? Go join a local civic organization, and when the opportunity comes up, be the person who volunteers to either be the secretary or the treasurer. You'll notice, by the way, in all your local organizations, that those are the two jobs that everybody hates. They are the best jobs that there are to have because you get to tell the story of what happened. You get to tell it your way. I used to tell people, I make history, right? And you get to keep track of all the money. What the hell's better than that? Come on, you guys. Always do the things that people don't want to do because there are great opportunities there. Now, you have to call me before you do this and take the Mike Bullis 5-minute course on how to take minutes, because if you become a lousy secretary, everybody will hate you. 10 pages of minutes for a half-hour meeting won't do, folks. You need to become known as the person who turns a 4-hour meeting into motions and actions, and who was present, and people will love you. People will absolutely love you, and you'll be a key to the organization. Not only that, it gives you a chance to show your competence on a regular basis, your skill. Same with the treasurer's report. Mostly the treasurers in organizations don't do anything. The organization actually hires an accountant or somebody to do that stuff. Your job is just to say, yeah, we have $882 in the treasury. Last month we helped 5 different groups, and it was very exciting, and you need to turn that treasurer's report into something exciting. And people will go like, God, it's finally we got somebody who will take that treasurer's job. Because people don't like to work. So they want to be the president, where you just sit around and run the meeting. Or they want to be the vice president, where you just wait around for the president to die. Or they want to be, or they want to be on the board and chair some committee. Everybody wants the positions that look like authority and power. They don't want to do the work. So you do the work, and you'll have your job within a month. So yes, it's a volunteer job, but it's a great opportunity for you. So reinventing is about taking what you have and taking the already available skill sets that you have and turning them into something else. And very often that involves just being willing to do what nobody else wants to do. Many people know I bought and sold restaurants for 10 years. Most people don't know how I got started. I just finished working for the legislature for 2 years in Oregon and the governor's office. I was a really high muckety-muck dude. But all of a sudden it was like October, and I knew I didn't have any contract work or anything to do until January or February, and I was trying to figure out how I was going to pay the bills. And I was at a friend's BE location one day visiting with her, and she slammed down the phone and said, darn it, and it wasn't that word, darn it, can't I get somebody to wash the dishes here? I said, what happened? She said, well, it's like my 3rd dishwasher in a month quit or whatever. And I said, well, pick me. And she said, I wouldn't insult you by asking you to wash my dishes. I said, no, insult me. I'm broke. I said, $4.35 an hour, looking really good right now. You pick me. And so she did, and I washed her dishes, and I started noticing things as the dishes came through. I started noticing there was consistently the same foods were left, the same vegetables and stuff. So I went and I talked to her. I said, you know, if we kind of perked up these vegetables a little bit, I think people would eat them. instead of just ignoring them and throwing them away. And she said, well, okay. And then I said, I had a few other ideas about the menu. So she kind of let me rewrite her afternoon menu. And then she made me her afternoon manager. And then I decided, if you're going to do this for a while, you maybe ought to go get a certification for BE. And then Oregon about that time was legalizing gambling in bars and restaurants. And so I said, if you're going to, but you had to have a liquor license to do that. And so then I went and got certified in BE and ran a BE operation for 2 years. And then went out and started buying and selling restaurants. Now, I've talked to other people, and this one holds true, by the way, in a lot of BE operations in the state. You think you're going to have to wait years to ever get a decent operation because, the competition is so fierce. And there's so many people, et cetera. So I, shortly after I got my license, applied to run the second largest BE cafeteria in the state. And I didn't apply because I thought I would get it. I applied because I wanted the practice of going through the process of the interview and talking to the agency and all that stuff. And nobody else applied. So I got the job, and I was like, what? I have no idea how to run. I didn't say that to anybody, but I was like, oh, my gosh. So I asked the other BE operators, why wouldn't you have applied to run that big operation? They said, oh, that thing's way too much work, man. We're not going to do that. You have machines all over the place that you have to keep filled all the time, and that's a full service cafeteria. And they said the labor you're going to have, and people kept telling me, and I was like, yeah, but I'm making serious money here, So, once again, I think we always assume that somehow there'll be this crowd waiting for us at the top trying to, and a lot of times you're surprised at how many people just don't want to do the hard work, don't want to do what it takes. So I ran that BE operation for a couple of years, learned everything I could about business, restaurant, food service management, and then bought my first restaurant and did that for about 10 years. And it was a phenomenal experience to get back out in the private sector and just be a business operator. So I'm trying to think about, what about you? What about you? Who wants to talk about what they have and how they could maybe use that, parlay that to reinvent themselves? Anybody? Who wants to talk? Stacy, are you here? You're in the process of thinking about whether you want to reinvent yourself, aren't you? You're trying to decide. Stacy, as everybody knows, you mind if I pick on you for a little bit? Okay, sure. Stacy is one of my heroes. She spent 5 years with Senator Brownback, and she's probably one of the most knowledgeable people around in our field right now about the Senate and Capitol Hill and all kinds of things. And yet she's trying to figure out what to do next. So one of the rules of reinvention is you want to use as much of what you already have as possible if you're going to take the next step on the ladder and make it the most valuable, right? Doesn't that make sense? That if she only picked, let's say of all the skills she had there, if she only picked tour guide, she could probably get a lot of jobs as a tour guide, okay? But would that really be a high-paying job that Stacy Cervenka could take and use in a powerful way? Not particularly, somebody says here. I agree. So Stacy, let's just walk through. How many separate jobs did you have in that one you had?
I brought a second.
Oh, you got a mic. Good, yeah. Great. Okay,
Check
so let's
two.
talk through how many jobs did you have?
Well,
Think
let's
about
see.
it.
There was tour guide. There was receptionist. There was,
policy
letter
analyst?
writer, policy analyst, researcher.
Researcher, okay.
Wrote memos, wrote press releases.
So you were a writer?
documents. Yep.
All right, and a press release writer, which means you got involved some with the media. Mm-hmm. Did you do interviews with media folks?
No, I gave the senator talking
You
points.
gave the senator talking. No, that's perfect though. Okay, what else?
Advised the senator. I did a lot of event planning.
Mm-hmm. So one thing you could pretty much say, and you kind of alluded to it yesterday, and this is really an essential. Some people think of it as a soft skill. I think of it as a hard skill. You really aren't intimidated by people and where they're positioned in life, are you? You can pretty much talk to any of them. Yes?
I think so.
Yeah. How many people could say that as calmly as she just said it? Yeah. Few people, right? Yeah. But most of us can't. Most of us are like, oh my God, senator, who, what, right? She's got an incredible little skill there that she needs to keep exercising. And by the way, all these skills are like exercise. You don't just get them and then they don't just stay with you forever. You have to keep using them all the time. So if you abandon them for 10 or 12 or 15 years and figure you're just going to come back and pick them right up, that's a youthful delusion. Doesn't happen that way. You have to keep exercising them. It's like your brain is just like every other muscle, and it works in parts. So yeah. What other skills? Can you think of any others you used?
I think that covers most things.
Okay. So you're a researcher. So there are several directions you could go, couldn't you? Have you thought about think tanks?
I have.
Uh-huh. How do you feel about it?
It would be fine, but I've learned that think tanks often don't have as much influence as they wish they did, and I sometimes feel like it's just a bunch of people sitting around, just navel-gazing. Yeah.
You in a group grow. Yeah, right. So for you, it's not just that you want to do the work; it's that you want to have influence.
Yes.
Okay. Well, no, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Have you thought about politics, Stacy?
I have.
And what do you think about it?
I think it would be fun. I think I really want to get more involved in campaigns. I think myself running for like school board or city council in the future would be a possibility.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I invented myself once. I had worked at the legislature in Oregon for many years, and we had term limits come into play, and I was concerned that all the sort of historical knowledge was leaving the House and the Senate, and pretty soon they were passing laws that they'd already passed 20 years earlier or had already worked on 20 years earlier and didn't even remember it. So I ran for the legislature in Oregon in 2000, and in the long run, we spent 10 months at it, $50,000. I lost by 300 votes. But who's counting? It was 302, but I don't want to, I mean, it's not, I don't hang with it, I don't like, kind of pine away about it or anything like that. But, no, I didn't want to recount.
I think there were a few hanging chads.
Yeah, that's right. I wasn't, it was clear I got whooping. I got whooping, and that's okay. Great experience. Hardest part of the experience, that is one time, the plus and a minus, was interesting that I knocked on several thousand doors. And two things. One, blindness was in my mind after I got the handle on it. Blindness was a real advantage, because when people opened the door, they didn't slam it. Okay. Now I don't know whether they thought I was begging. I don't know what the hell they thought I was doing, but they didn't slam the door, and I had their immediate attention, didn't I? So when I said, look, I'm here because I'm a candidate for the Oregon legislature, and I want to talk to you about crime, and I want to talk to you about education in our district and the kinds of things we need to do to improve it, I had their attention, okay? I got closer than anyone thought I would in that election. The hardest people to deal with were the reporters, because the reporters always want to talk about blindness, and that's a legislative killer. Run for the legislature has nothing to do with blindness, and if all my candidacy focused on blindness, I'd be gone. It wouldn't happen. So they would say, well, so what is it like to be blind and knocking on doors? And I'd say, the real issues of this candidacy are about crime and the problems we have in our streets. And they would say, so how did you learn that as a blind person? And blah, blah, blah. They wanted to do a human interest story, and I ain't having it, because human interest stories are not what get you elected. People don't elect you because you're cute or because you have, because you're blind. In fact, they're going to not elect you for that reason, I think. So it was very interesting, but you had to learn to be, you had to learn to look past that. But I found that my blindness, at least in the door knocking stage, was an advantage because I got their attention. I used it quickly, and I must say, there were several of my friends who told me that they would never run for the legislature because they're sure their blindness would have been a disadvantage. And I think you have to see it for what it is. I think occasionally that isn't so. What did you say? You said, I thought about it, but I want to run for the school. That's absolutely the way to do it. Start out in small community stuff, right? So you have to do something while you're running for the school board and things. So we're still back to that job, aren't we?
Yes.
But if you're going to be local, is local going to be California or Kansas, or do you know yet?
Probably not Kansas,
no?
But probably either California or DC or somewhere up in the upper Midwest.
Okay. You pay a price every time you move.
I know.
I want to say that only just for the record because I've done it a lot of times. So, don't take my advice just because I live it. That's not important. Obviously don't. But you really do, and it's painful because even though we live in this virtual, digital not touch world where we're all over the world and we can communicate instantaneously, the honest truth is being close to people and having them in your community and seeing them every day is really still very important. And every time you move, you have to rebuild that local connection. It was very difficult for me. I moved from Oregon to Baltimore in 2002. For those of you who wonder why in the world I would do that, I accidentally reinvented myself when I met this girl who became pregnant and she was going to have my child, and it was time to move to Baltimore. Okay, that's what you do. So sometimes you reinvent, and so there I was, 3,000 miles across country. People said, "Could you have thought of a further place to move and still stayed in the continent?" And I said, "Well, not many, but I did know some people there." And I knew people who came through there. I knew some folks at NFB. I knew people who worked at Blind Industries and Services in Maryland. I had met occasionally, so I turned those occasional meetings into more than that, and so on. But at first it was a real struggle, and then I wanted to be part of the broader disability community because that's certainly an interest of mine. And so I began saying to BISM, "Why don't you let me go represent you on some of the state committees on disability?" And they said, "Good, because we don't really like to do that stuff anyway. That's not just blindness, it's all them other disabilities, and we don't care about that so much." And I said, "Great, I'm on it, man." So I went and met other people and so on. Volunteering to serve on committees is a great way to do it, as long as you don't become known as the committee person and you fill your resume up with all that nonsense. I want to switch subjects for just a second. When you volunteer, try never to say that on your resume, okay? It's just as valuable experience as any other, so just say it. You know, worked for Red Cross for a year and a half from 2005 to 2007, whatever. Don't say, "I volunteered for the Red Cross," and nobody cares. Nobody wants, in fact, if they do care, who cares? Don't tell them. None of their business. The other thing I want you to think about eliminating, in case you happen to be doing it, is months. Began work at such and so place in 9/7 of 06, finished in 10/8 of 07. Nonsense. You started there in 06 and you finished in 07. Could have been as much as 2 years you were there, okay? Stop this. Don't do this month stuff. It's just, ooh, it just feels bad. It gets people focused on increments of time that are so unimportant, okay? So drop the month stuff. And besides that, and if you leave a job anywhere close to the end of the year, you were there the whole year. You know, 2011, and then in 2012, you get a job, then it's 2012. So what? Your resume looks like, even if you're out of work as much as a year, your resume looks like there was no break, right? Sell it, okay? Don't lie. If you don't get a job till 2013, you got a real problem. So then you were a consultant in 2012.
That's right.
Okay? You know, I'm not saying that you should lie, and I'm certainly not saying that those little tricks I just gave you are going to count for some experience that you don't have. You got me? What I'm saying is, you don't need to be making glaring holes in your resume and showing them to everybody every time you hand the silly thing out. You need to sort of brush over those kinds of things and make them look prettier than they might otherwise look. That's all. So, Stacy, what do you think? DC? Do you know a lot of people in DC?
I do.
What do you like about DC?
I love the atmosphere in DC. I like that everybody's doing a really interesting job, and the jobs there are really sort of are interesting. Mm-hmm. What concerns me, I guess, about DC is raising a family in DC. The cost of living is really high. What kind of quality of life is my family going to have?
What about Alexandria or some of the surrounding burgs?
It's possible, still very expensive.
Yeah, well, very expensive. But you being a rich woman who's a researcher and a, what are all your skills again?
Researching, tour guiding,
well, forget the tour guide for a second. Well, let's just focus on the big ones.
I know.
A policy
Writing, yes.
She's a policy analyst. She's a researcher. She's been an aide to a senator. Those are pretty big skills. You can parlay out a pretty reasonable salary, don't you think?
Probably.
You know, the tour guide thing is just something you might fall back on the evenings and weekends. Right. Yeah.
There are lots of jobs for press release people, too. Like my agency had a whole position for a person who never comes into work, by the way.
Sweet.
Nice. Her job is to do the press stuff.
awesome. Oh yes, I love blogging.
Say your name for everyone too. Thank you.
This is George. I would suggest Stacy might make a very effective, dare I use the word, lobbyist.
Well, I was going to ask her about that issue. Have you thought about whether you want to become a lobbyist, or had you just seen enough of them when you were on the other side of that desk? No, I would love to become a lobbyist. You would? It is something that I think about. Yeah. Lobbying can be incredibly rewarding. One of my reinventions was that I didn't know anything about the legislature, but I went to the Oregon legislature to work on, initially on actually legislation for the blind community as a volunteer, and got to know how to present legislation. Here's one thing I would say. If you want to reinvent yourself, you need to look at what people want. And I started looking around the Oregon legislature at people who testified before the Senate and the House. And I started noticing that the people that senators and representatives liked the best were people who could concisely and quickly say what the bill was, why they wanted it, and get down and shut up. And not very many people could do that. Yeah, I think you probably are. And because you've been trained by some experts, I suspect, right? So I started noticing that, and I started testifying, and I, along the way, would go in and visit with senators and reps, and one day a senator said to me, you know, we've got to have a committee hearing coming up on this such and such a bill. Would you mind just coordinating all the testimony for us? I said, sure, be glad to. So which one thing led to another, and I was the director of a task force for the legislature and the governor's office, and so on and so forth. Again, volunteered, turned into a job, learned immense amounts about government, and it all started as a lobbyist. It all began from there. You know, you have to ask yourself hard questions about lobbying. That is, am I doing something that's honest, decent, and worthy? And there are two kinds of lobbyists. There are two kinds of lobbyists. Where one group for whom whoever pays the biggest bucks, you're basically just the H word. You'll just do whatever people pay you to do, without much, whatever, regard for what it means. And then there are the integrity lobbyists, people who will only do it if it means the right thing for the right groups, et cetera. And they're usually poor, and they don't, they don't have homes. But no, just kidding. Not true. But there really are some opportunities for that, and you ought to think about it, and think about how you might do it. Have you given that much thought? You're a natural. You present well. That's one of the keys. You present well. You have the experience. One of the first prerequisites that people on the Hill look for when they want to hire somebody when not people on the Hill, but when companies want to hire somebody as a lobbyist, is they say, has the person ever worked where? On the Hill. If you haven't, it's like, why would we hire you? You don't even know where the restroom is, all right? You not only know where the restroom is, but you know every other part too. So you're a real commodity. You might think about that. All right. Any other thoughts for Stacy? Let's see. Talk to me about time, Brian. Great. That's perfect. We talked a little bit about my move to Baltimore, and we talked about the formation of the Image Center. I was working for the state of Oregon at one point, and part of the reason why you might want to make a change sometimes is that you simply get burnt out. It happened to me once. I was working with the state of Oregon, and between the politics and the agency and other things, I'd had enough. And I had a friend who was a motorcycle mechanic, and a good one. And I had the desire to get out of Oregon, and so we came up with this brilliant idea at 24 years old that what we were going to do is open up a motorcycle shop and a gas station, because the gas station would function as the sort of ground for the motorcycle shop and keep the bills paid and the doors open, and we would just be free as a bird to build this motorcycle shop in this small little town called Goldendale, Washington, and oh my God, it was just going to be wonderful. So we did. We found this gas station up there, a Texaco service station that apparently nobody wanted. We didn't quite understand that at the time, but we certainly did later. And we bought this service station and put in a motorcycle shop, and then in 1979, the price of gas went from 60 cents to over $1 in about 4 months. It was just talk about not a happy customer around. People hated us, and ultimately the business went broke. Also not a happy time for me. It was my first big business failure. And, you know, my grandmother used to say, you need to learn how to laugh about the things now that you'll laugh about 10 years from now. And I told her before she died, I said, Grandma, I never did learn how to laugh about that one. Maybe I'll get there, but that was just painful. There were some incredible lessons, but one of the lessons I learned was that you can't reach too far out of your zone. That for me, I could go out and I finally figured out I could change a tire for a vehicle and so forth, but I just didn't know anything in depth about cars and the kinds of things I had to know, and I wasn't a mechanic, and even though I was going to handle the front end sales and the employee supervision and all the accounting and other details and all the press stuff about it wasn't enough. There were just there were other things that I simply didn't know enough about the business specifically itself, and so I lost a lot of money, ended up being in debt for several years trying to pay all that back, and learned an incredibly valuable lesson about reinvention, and that is you can't reach too far unless you know you have those skill sets underneath you and can feel comfortable with them. Came back to Oregon after that, worked for an independent living older blind program for about a year, then became the client assistance program director for the state. I loved mediation. In my dealings with blindness organizations, I discovered that I had an aptitude for dealing with fighting parties who didn't like each other and keeping them from killing each other. And actually got people to agree on things. So we went to the legislature and calmed down issues in the Commission for the Blind. We were able to create a new commission that everybody was happy with in terms of a board of directors. And so I discovered I had this facility for kind of bringing different disparate groups together and helping them work on common issues. The ACB declared me an honorary member. The NFB I was already a member of, and everybody laughed about it all and said, yeah, I guess, that's just who he is, and nobody killed me. So when the client assistance program came open and needed somebody, I was the person people wanted. They said, we know he'll be fair, he'll listen to both sides of complaints, and so on. So I did that for 8 or 10 years, and then took a step outside of just the client assistance program, because I saw that as primarily a mediation role, into private mediation, and had a great time doing private business-to-business mediation and consumer-to-company mediation out in the private sector. It was a lot of fun, great business. I ran it until 1994 when I left to go buy and sell restaurants, et cetera. So again, I took a skill, developed it a little bit further, and then sort of stepped a little bit over the edge in order to get something else going on in the private mediation field. And still to this day, I would love to go back. I think this whole reinventing is important in today's field, but one of the common sort of things about it is, did you notice how easy it was for Stacy to tell us what her skills were? How many people can do that? How many people can rattle off for me in 30 seconds, here are the 5 things that my competencies that I had in that particular job? And you notice, by the way, nothing that she said had anything to do with blindness. I don't care that she wrote some of her letters on a word processor or on a computer using JAWS. In fact, neither does her employer. It didn't matter that she said she was a tour guide who used a cane, okay? She's a tour guide. I think we focus too often on blindness, and other people don't necessarily focus on it. People want to know that you can do the job and that you're competent, and after that, if they figured out that you can make them money and she's got all this experience on the Hill, I don't think they're going to say, well, you got all this experience on the Hill and you know all these people, but you're blind. I mean, wouldn't that be stupid? You wouldn't want to work for that person anyway, would you? Yes. Yeah. Well, Stacy's off getting some coaching right now. But I think, the issue very often is you just have to, we focus far more on the blindness than other people necessarily would. provided that you have those skills. Does anybody doubt that she really was competent in those skill sets? I don't. I've seen her in action. She really was good. And so whether it takes working on weekends or nights or whatever it took for her to become that tour guide of the Capitol, you know what? She did it. She doesn't talk about it, but I'll bet you there were a few times when she wandered around those halls very carefully when nobody was looking. I had to go to court a couple of years ago, and I went into court about an hour and a half earlier and figured out where the witness stand was and where all the chairs were and everything. So when I went up and testified, the judge probably thought I was a genius. I don't know what he thought. And then somewhere during the presentation, I said, Your Honor, may I leave the bench for just a moment? And he said, sure. And I went back and I grabbed some papers and I brought them back up and so forth. And because the issue was about blindness, and the issue was demonstrating competence about blindness, and I wanted this judge to see that I could do stuff. But do you think I could have done that if I hadn't gone in an hour and a half earlier to figure out where everything was? Of course not. But I got to tell you, I can't tell you how many people I see, blind and otherwise disabled people, come to the legislature to testify. They don't know where the desk is. They don't know where to sit down. They don't know what to do. They fumble around for 5 minutes, and then they wonder why they don't look competent. You don't look competent because you weren't. You know, you have to be honest. Okay? Yes. Sure. Uh-huh. Yeah.
I also used to have I had a truck. I used to go by some wholesale market.
Right.
Have someone drive me around the village, and we would sell fruits retail.
Sure.
The problem was, I mean, it was my business, and the guys who drove for me were some lazy scoundrels.
Sure. That's the nature of that business, by the way.
So sometimes they won't get up.
Right.
And I'll be stuck.
Because they're drunk or hungover, or they're on drugs or whatever. Yeah, I understand.
I'll
Yeah.
be stuck, and I'm
Right.
like, man, I need to only do things
Right.
that I can manage.
Right.
To an extent. So how do you?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. I'm going to answer the specific first because it's important. In the restaurant business, it's a business full of people with problems. So the first thing you want to do is try and figure out how can I get out of that. What I did a couple of times in order to get key people that I really wanted is I hired people who were retired older folks, okay? Because they're gems. And they got work ethic like you wouldn't believe. And they're reliable, and they're too young to get a new girlfriend. And, you know, they're just not going to, you know, they're not going to show up drunk tomorrow. They don't drink more than a glass of wine a week. I mean, come on, you know? So you look at that and see if you can reach outside of that. The other thing is and this is a little risky because you have to interview carefully, but get college kids who don't intend to work in the food business except while they're going to college as kind of a thing that they're going to do, and use them because sometimes they can be really good employees and they're going to move on. But you know that going in, and you also know that, you know, they want to, this is maybe their first or second or third job, so they're trying to get experience as well. So, yeah, get out of the ordinary restaurant or food service crowd because it's a mess. As far as, you know, what was your first question about? Yeah, so the first way to know about your skill sets is what has anybody ever paid you to do? Because that helps you look at you from other people's viewpoint. What has somebody paid me to do? If they paid me to do it, they must have thought I was valuable enough to do it. And so that's your first line. The second thing is get some trusted friends and say to them, what am I good at and what do you see that I'm not good at, right? The third thing is really you have to learn sometimes because most people won't, or not a lot of people won't tell us the truth because we're blind. They don't want to hurt our feelings, so they just say, oh, you're doing just wonderful, you know. If you can even get across the street, they think you're a marvelous traveler, and on and on and on it goes, right? So it's difficult sometimes. So you have to learn to, and it's difficult, but that's where a job coach or a life coach or somebody who really, really you can trust comes into play, that you know has good judgment, and you can say to them, look, tell me the truth. Is this really a well-written letter or is it a piece of junk? I mean, I tell you, I get junk from people every day, and they actually think they're going to be applying for professional jobs with me, and they can't string sentences together in a coherent way. I'm so glad for that, by the way, because it's the open market for me. I can still get a job as a good writer, because as long as there are as many bad writers out there as there are, there's a lot of room at the top, okay? So become a good writer, but you know, look at that and get some other people to evaluate it and let them tear it apart and tell you, look, you know, you're too wordy, or you're, you know, look, you know, 39-word sentences just don't work. You know, we lost track of the beginning before we got to the end, you know. Let people be honest with you about that kind of stuff. And then take that, take all those skill sets that you have, and then, you know, use the bowls. You know, What Color's Your Parachute has some of those great skill charts in there where you can say, okay, what jobs can I do with all of these skills, and sort of fill those in, and then look at the ones that are maybe close but not quite the cigar, okay? They will tend to focus in on your major skill sets and the major kind of jobs you can do, and then start looking at some of those subsets and say, well, I've never done that job, but I do see how all my skill sets fit with that job, and use those tools that are out there. I love bowls, by the way. I'm a big fan. Yes. Hey, Kirk. Sure. Grab a mic, Kirk. Yeah. Unless you want to hear. Hang on. I can pass this across.
I just want to put in a plug for the book that Mike just mentioned. It is called What Color is Your Parachute? I checked it out of the Talking Book and Braille Library after working for 10 years in banking and brokerage and financial advice, and I moved into the nonprofit sector, into the fundraising side of things, and that book helped me understand that I had this skill set around talking to wealthy people about money and not being shy about discussing their finances, and understanding people's tax needs, and then it led me to my passion for being in the nonprofit sector and the social justice sector, and it showed me how I could take what I'd learned in one industry and translate it into a career in another industry. And it's, you know, it's a simple set of exercises the book has you do, and you can buy it for $5 on Audible. And, you know, it takes some time. There's actually exercises. You actually have to do some homework and sit down and think and write some stuff down. But I just wanted to emphasize, you know, Mike mentioned it, I think, yesterday and today, and I just want to put a plug in for it as a $5 career coach in a box. So.
Absolutely. And the best career advice you'll ever get. And let me say something else. Did you just notice something? I want to tell you, let me ask you, what job in my corporate, in my nonprofit, what job do you think people hate the most? Fundraising, baby. Do you think people are going to turn you down if you go in and say, you know what, I'd like to help your organization raise money? They're going to say, oh my God, you're kidding, right? But how many of you do that? How many of us do that? Oh, no, I hate fundraising. I don't like to ask people for money. Well, how do you think you're going to get paid? Magic? Where do you think all that comes from? People don't want to do the hard jobs. And more in this corporate environment today, nonprofit environment, if you don't have if you don't have a generator, if you don't have a means for your program to generate income, your program is probably looking at the chopping block some way or other, okay? It is big in nonprofits now, and if you don't have a business niche and can't find one, you're in trouble. You're close to trouble or near it. So I think, sure, hang on just a second. Let me see. Is that Kathy? No? Okay. Yes. Oh, I thought there was somebody over there that was trying to get us to quit. We're running out of time.
Okay, just one quick thing.
Sure.
When he's talking about how hard it is for fundraising, I had my God Dog group a couple months ago. We had fundraiser, and it's not easy. You know, it took us a couple months just to get everything done. So it is a lot of work.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes.
I've got a final question to tie the ribbons on it.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm glad somebody can do that.
Okay. Try to. So we've been hearing a lot about your skills, your sort of scrappiness, your various reinventions, and you've given maybe 112 practical suggestions here. But I've got a larger question, which is somehow you have this thing, this self-confidence, this sort of you can do it. Where'd that come from? And is this in your genes, or what brought you there? And I want you to talk a little bit about your blindness and why it's not a problem, or if it is a problem, how do you deal with it? Beyond all the practical suggestions, How'd you get right to take all these steps that you're telling us how to do?
Wow. Okay, so, thanks. Well, look, I think, I'm not sure how to answer that question. It's so profound in some ways. I recognized when I was about 18 or 19 years old that I was a lazy, spoiled, blind kid who had gotten my way through school by doing half the work that I needed to do and getting A's on the test, by letting people tell me how cute and wonderful I was, and then being lazy and not doing the hard stuff, right? I remember one time I told this teacher, I said, instead of doing a term paper, can I just give a talk? Because I knew I was good at that. You know what the teacher said? Yeah, sure. Because he was stupid, right? I realized that I couldn't do what a lot of people did. I couldn't go into the military. That's where a lot of people get their discipline, okay? They go in the military, and even the laziest people, spoiled kids, can go in the military and get some discipline. I couldn't do that. So I decided I had to do it myself. And the other thing I decided along the way is that I had to meet a lot of blind people because I didn't know much about what blind people could do. And as long as I had this little narrow world of mine where all I knew was one or two blind people, and the other ones I knew were mostly had other issues going on, and they were kind of funny, and maybe some of them were retarded, and I just didn't have much to do with them. And I realized, you know, that's not going to cut it. You've got to go meet a lot of blind people and get to know them. So I did. I went to, as I told you yesterday, I went to consumer conventions because I could see thousands of examples for myself, some better, some worse, but I realized I was no great shake, so I needed to really improve my skills. So I started walking 15, 20 miles a week, traveling with my cane, because I realized that poise is important, and one of the ways you get poise and skill is, at least for me as a guy, was about travel. And so I worked hard. I learned how to read Braille aloud at reading speed that was comparable. In other words, I can read aloud in Braille, and it took me a long time to practice it. But I realized one of the things sighted people do in meetings is they read things, right? And that blind people had trouble doing that because they were like haltingly reading their Braille and everything. I said, this isn't going to do. So I just practiced days in and day out how to read Braille at speed. When it came to typing, I could type 75, 80 words a minute. I wanted to get those skills down so that when people gave me a task, I could produce the results, right? That really became important to me. I'm a guy. I tend to orient toward, task results. What do you want to do? Blindness was important at those levels because I had to get those skills out of the way. My contention has always been that you need to work really hard at some time in your life on blindness and get it out of the way. If it's number 1 or number 2 on your list every day, it's a problem. It should move up and down your scale. It should be down at 10 or 15 or 20 some days, and all the other things you got to do are way higher than blindness. And then maybe some days it pops up to number 3 or 4 when something happens, but mostly it's just you got those skills, and blindness becomes sort of this thing you have to deal with, but not the central thing you have to deal with. There's other important things that you have to deal with, like, paying the bills or mowing the lawn or whatever it is, what my boss is an idiot, whatever. Whatever those things are, but that implied that I had to get really good skills. And so I worked on that a lot. And Brian, I'm not sure what the other part, what's this quality? Well, when I was very young, 7, 8 years old, I remember we were out camping once. My dad and I were, and my brother and some other folks were out camping, and I was telling my dad about how these rich people had moved into our neighborhood and what how they were. I was sure they were a bunch of phonies, and I was sure they were a bunch of snobs, and little kids, we don't know nothing, right? We just babble on. I don't know what I thought, but I remember feeling this sort of arrogant feeling like, yeah, they think they're better than us, and those rich people, and on and on and on. And my dad stopped me and said, that attitude's never going to get you anywhere. And I said, what? He goes, you should go study Will Rogers. And I was like, what? Who's Will Rogers? And he said, that's your problem. You don't know. He said, Will Rogers was a man in the late 1800s, early 1900s who really could meet with anybody at their level. And he said, you need to practice that art of really taking people at their level and being comfortable with people at all levels. He said, the difference between you and Will Rogers is that he could go meet the Queen of England and be comfortable with her and respectful with her and an equal with her, while the next day he might go down and meet the bum in the ghetto. and be respectful and equal with him. He said, you're never going to get it anywhere by feeling better, by setting up, better than or worse thans with people. And to this day, things just stick in your head. To this day, I can feel the campfire. To this day, I can feel that experience, and it penetrated me. I said, later on I realized that's part of what love is about. Part of what love is about is sort of learning to get into other people's heads and getting out of your own. Learning to feel other people where they're at, not in your own. And so when it comes to trying to reinvent yourself, or when it comes to trying to get that job, it's about getting into your boss's head or your fellow employee's head and saying, what do they need? What are their needs? Not what are my needs. Sometimes our needs just overwhelm everything. And what we have to do is stop and say, love is getting out of myself and into what somebody else needs, and figuring out how I can help the person, the organization, whatever it is. How can I move them forward? Because you know what? Every time I do, it doesn't make any difference if today's person gets it. Every time I learn the art of getting out of myself and loving someone else a little bit more, what happens? I grow, and it will come back to me. The people today don't have to get it. The ones next year will, and next year. And life really is, over time, fair. Life really is, over time, going to get you what you want. It may not in every instance, and you need to get not hung up on that. Does that help a little, Brian? I don't know.
Yes, it does. Thank you. And we'll have another whack with Mike next tomorrow. Thank you so much. I think at this point, we'll take a 10-minute break, and I mean a precise 10-minute break.